The cameras were rolling, the orchestra was playing, thousands of people were watching, and Elvis Presley was in the middle of a song when a little boy suddenly stood up in the audience and screamed his name. "Elvis!" The music stopped. Not faded, not slowed, stopped. Every musician on the stage froze. Johnny Carson turned toward the audience, expecting a harmless interruption. But then he saw the boy's face, and the smile disappeared from his own. The boy wasn't excited. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't trying to get on television. He was crying. And in his small hand he was holding a folded piece of paper. Elvis stared at him from the stage. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then Elvis slowly lowered the microphone. "What is it, son?" The boy took a shaky breath. "I need to ask you something." Elvis nodded. "Go ahead." The boy looked directly into the eyes of the most famous entertainer in America and asked a question that nobody in that studio was prepared to hear. "Can I sing your song with you?" A few people laughed. Someone in the audience clapped. Johnny Carson leaned back with a grin. It looked like the perfect television moment, a cute little interruption, a famous singer, a nervous child, a story everyone would laugh about the next morning. But Elvis didn't laugh. Instead, he looked at the boy's mother, and the moment he saw her face, everything changed. She was crying, not smiling, not embarrassed, crying. Elvis looked back at the boy. "Bring him up here." The audience erupted. The little boy slowly walked toward the stage. His mother covered her mouth. Elvis stepped down from the stage and met him halfway. He reached out his hand. "Come on." The boy took it. His fingers were ice cold. Elvis felt them trembling. "You nervous?" The boy nodded. "Very." Elvis smiled gently. "Don't worry, I'm nervous too." The audience laughed. The boy didn't. He kept staring at Elvis, almost as if he was trying to memorize his face. Elvis noticed. He crouched down. "What's your name?" The boy told him. Elvis repeated it. Then he asked, "You really know my song?" "Yes." "All the words?" The boy nodded. "All of them." Elvis smiled. "Then you're going to have to prove it." The crowd laughed again. The orchestra prepared to start. The conductor raised his hand. Elvis looked at the boy. "Ready?" The boy nodded, but just before the music began, he reached into his pocket. He pulled out the folded paper. Elvis glanced at it. "What's that?" The boy hesitated. "My dad's letter." Elvis's expression changed. "Your dad?" The boy nodded. "He told me to give it to you." Elvis looked toward the boy's mother. She slowly shook her head. "Not yet." Elvis understood. He looked back at the boy. "After the song." The boy nodded. The orchestra began. The first notes filled the studio. The boy stepped toward the microphone. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His eyes widened. The entire audience was watching him. He looked terrified. Elvis leaned toward him. "Don't look at them." The boy looked at Elvis. "Look at me." The boy nodded. Elvis smiled. "Now sing." The boy took a breath and began. His voice was small, unpolished, a little shaky, but there was something in it, something raw, something that made the room gradually fall silent. He wasn't singing like a child who wanted to become famous. He was singing like a child who had been practicing the same song for someone who would never hear it again. Elvis listened. His smile slowly disappeared. The boy continued, one line, then another, and when he reached the chorus, Elvis joined him. The audience erupted. But Elvis wasn't performing anymore. He was watching the boy. The boy was watching Elvis. Their voices came together, and for a brief moment the entire studio seemed to disappear. There was no Johnny Carson, no orchestra, no cameras, no screaming audience. Only a little boy and the man whose songs had become part of his childhood. Then the boy suddenly stopped. Elvis looked at him. "What happened?" The boy shook his head. "I forgot the words." Elvis smiled. "That's okay." The boy looked embarrassed. Elvis leaned closer. "Sing what you remember." The boy hesitated. "I don't remember the next part." Elvis nodded. "Then sing something else." The boy looked confused. "Like what?" Elvis answered softly. "Like how you feel." The boy stared at him. Then something happened that nobody expected. He began singing his own words. They weren't part of Elvis's song. They weren't written by a songwriter. They came from a child singing about his father. The studio became silent. The boy sang about a man who used to sit beside his bed at night, a man who played Elvis records whenever the house felt too quiet, a man who told his son that some voices could make you feel less alone. And then came the final line. The boy's voice cracked. "He said one day we'd meet you together." Elvis stopped moving. The orchestra stopped. Nobody clapped. The boy looked at him. But he never got to. Elvis's eyes dropped. The boy's mother began to cry harder. Elvis looked toward her. "I'm sorry." She shook her head. "You don't have to be." Elvis turned back to the boy. "How long?" The boy didn't understand. Elvis asked again, "How long has he been gone?" The boy looked down. 21 days. Elvis closed his eyes for a moment. Then he placed one hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "I wish I'd known." The boy whispered, "He knew." Elvis looked at him. "Knew what?" "That you would understand." The words hit Elvis differently. He slowly removed his hand. "What did your father tell you about me?" The boy reached into his pocket again. He pulled out the folded paper. "This." He handed it to Elvis. Elvis stared at the envelope. There was something about the handwriting, something strangely familiar. He turned it over. No address, no stamp. Only one sentence written across the front. "For Elvis, only if my son ever meets you." Elvis's face went still. Johnny Carson leaned forward. Even the audience seemed to understand that something had just changed. Elvis opened the letter. The first line was simple. "Dear Elvis." Elvis read it. Then he read the next line. His breathing slowed. He continued. Halfway through the page, his hand began to tremble. Johnny Carson noticed. "Elvis?" Elvis didn't answer. He kept reading. The boy watched him. "What does it say?" Elvis folded the paper slightly. "Nothing," but his voice betrayed him. The boy's mother stepped forward. "You need to read the last part." Elvis looked at her. "You knew?" She nodded. "He wanted you to know." Elvis looked back at the letter. Then he read the final paragraph. His eyes stopped. He didn't blink. He didn't move. He simply stared at one sentence, a sentence that reached back years before that little boy had ever been born. A sentence about a night Elvis himself had almost forgotten. A night when he had made a promise to a stranger. A promise he never thought anyone remembered. The boy looked up at him. "Is it true?" Elvis slowly lowered the letter. "What?" "What Dad wrote." Elvis looked into the child's eyes. "What did he tell you?" The boy answered. "He said you promised him something." Elvis went completely silent. Johnny Carson looked at him. The audience waited. The cameras were still recording every second. Elvis finally spoke. "Your father," he stopped. He swallowed. "What's his full name?" The boy told him. Elvis's face turned pale, because he knew that name. He knew exactly who the boy's father was. And suddenly the letter made sense. The promise, the meeting, the reason the boy had been brought there. Everything. Elvis looked toward the cameras, then toward Johnny Carson, then back at the little boy. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Who told you to come here?" The boy looked confused. "My mother." Elvis shook his head. "No." He pointed gently toward the letter. "Who told your mother?" The boy looked at his mother. She couldn't answer. Elvis stepped closer. "Who knew I would be here tonight?" The woman began crying. Then she finally whispered, "Your father did." Elvis froze. The boy's eyes widened. "What does that mean?" His mother looked at Elvis. "He knew this day would happen." Elvis stared at her. "How?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out something else, a small black and white photograph. She handed it to Elvis. He looked down. The photograph showed a much younger Elvis standing beside another man, a man Elvis hadn't seen in decades. Elvis's fingers tightened around the photograph. He looked at the boy, then at the photograph. And suddenly, he understood why the boy's father had sent him. This wasn't a fan letter. It wasn't a dying man's goodbye. It was a message. A message Elvis had been waiting decades to receive, without even knowing it. The little boy stepped closer. "Mr. Presley?" Elvis looked at him. "My dad said you would know what to do." Elvis's eyes filled with tears. "What did he want me to do?" The boy reached into his pocket one final time. This time, there was no letter. There was a tiny old key. He placed it in Elvis's palm. "My dad said—" The boy hesitated. Elvis waited. "He said you would know what this opens." Elvis stared at the key. His face changed completely, because he recognized it. He had seen that key once before, decades ago, on a night he had promised himself he would never remember again. Elvis slowly closed his hand around it. Then he looked toward Johnny Carson. "Johnny?" Carson stood. "Yes?" Elvis looked at the cameras. "Stop the show." Nobody moved. The audience didn't understand. The orchestra didn't understand. Johnny Carson didn't understand. Then Elvis looked directly into the camera and said the words that would have changed the entire broadcast if they had ever been aired. There are some stories you don't tell on television. He turned toward the little boy. But this one... Elvis looked down at the key in his hand. "I think I owe him the truth." And somewhere behind the studio walls, a producer suddenly realized that the cameras were still recording. Everything. The cameras were still rolling. Nobody in the studio knew what to do. The orchestra had gone completely silent. Johnny Carson was standing beside his chair, staring at Elvis Presley as if he had just watched a television show turn into something no scriptwriter could have imagined. Elvis was still holding the little key. He hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. He simply stared at it. The little boy stood in front of him. His mother stood several feet behind. And for the first time that evening, Elvis looked less like the king of rock and roll and more like a man who had just been confronted by his past. Johnny finally broke the silence. "Elvis?" Elvis looked at him. Carson lowered his voice. "Do you know what that key is?" Elvis nodded slowly. "Yes." "What does it open?" Elvis looked down. His thumb moved across the old metal. "It opens something I haven't seen in a very long time." Johnny waited. Elvis continued. "Something I thought was gone." The boy looked confused. "What is it?" Elvis looked at him. "A room?" "What room?" Elvis didn't answer immediately. He looked at the photograph again, the young Elvis, the other man beside him. The old photograph was faded, but there was no mistaking the face. It was the boy's father. Only he wasn't a father in the photograph. He was a young man, almost Elvis's age. And Elvis remembered him, not from television, not from a concert, from somewhere much more personal, somewhere almost nobody knew about. Elvis slowly sat down on the edge of the stage. The boy sat beside him. Johnny remained standing. "What happened that night?" Johnny asked. Elvis looked at him. "I was young." He paused. "Young enough to think I had all the answers." The audience listened. Elvis looked at the photograph again. "Back then, there were people around me all the time. Managers, musicians, friends, strangers. People who wanted something." He smiled faintly. "But this man," he tapped the photograph, "he didn't want anything." The boy stared at the picture. "That was my dad?" Elvis nodded. "He was." "What was his name?" The boy told him. Elvis repeated it quietly. Then he closed his eyes, and suddenly the studio disappeared. For Elvis, the lights were gone, the audience was gone, the cameras were gone. He was somewhere else. Years earlier, a cold night, a small building, a young Elvis standing outside a locked door, and beside him, the boy's father. Back then, Elvis wasn't yet the untouchable legend people would later imagine. He was simply a young man trying to understand what his life was becoming. That night, something had gone wrong, something serious. Elvis had been angry, confused, exhausted, and ready to walk away from a decision that could change his career forever. The young man beside him had said something Elvis never forgot. "Don't become the person everybody expects you to be." Elvis had laughed. "What am I supposed to become?" The man looked at him.
"Yourself." Elvis smiled at the memory. Then his expression darkened. "That was the last time I saw him." The boy's eyes widened. "Why?" Elvis looked at his mother. She answered. "He left the city the next morning." "Why?" She hesitated. "Because he thought Elvis needed to forget him." Elvis looked shocked. "Forget him?" She nodded. "He believed your career was about to become something enormous." Elvis looked down. "And he didn't want to be part of it?" "He didn't want you to feel responsible for him." Elvis slowly shook his head. "I never knew." "He never told you." "Why?" She looked at the boy. "Because he believed you had enough people asking things from you." Elvis's eyes became wet. The little boy looked at him. "My dad always said you were different." Elvis smiled sadly. "He knew me before the world did." The words hung in the air. Then Elvis looked at the key.
"What did he tell you about this?" The boy answered. "He said you would recognize it." Elvis nodded. "I do." "What does it open?" Elvis stood. "A place where he left something for me." Johnny stepped forward. "Something?" Elvis nodded. "He told me once." He stopped. The memory was difficult. "He told me that if we ever lost contact, He would leave something there. The boy asked. What? Elvis looked at him. I don't know. Then why didn't you go back? Elvis stared at the floor. Because the building was demolished. Silence. Johnny looked confused. Then how can the key still matter? Elvis looked at him. That's what I don't understand. The boy's mother slowly opened her purse. She pulled out an old envelope. She handed it to Elvis. This came to me after the funeral. Elvis took it. There was another photograph inside. This one showed an old building, a small door, and above the door was a faded number. Elvis stared at it. His expression changed. No. Johnny looked over his shoulder. What? Elvis pointed at the photograph. That building wasn't demolished. The mother looked surprised. What? It was supposed to be. Elvis turned the photograph around. On the back was an address. He recognized it immediately. He had been there. Years ago. He had stood in front of that door. He had held the same key. But he had never opened it, because that night he had chosen his career instead. The boy looked at him. What's inside? Elvis didn't answer. He looked at the clock, then at Johnny, then at the cameras. The live broadcast was still continuing. Johnny finally asked the question everyone in the studio was thinking. Elvis, are you saying you want to leave the show? Elvis looked at him. I think I have to. The audience murmured. The producer behind the camera started waving frantically. The schedule was being destroyed. Commercial break, next segment. Everything was supposed to be timed perfectly. But Elvis didn't care. He walked toward the boy. Do you want to know what your father left? The boy nodded. Yes. Then we're going to find out. The boy's mother immediately stepped forward. You can't! Elvis stopped. Why not? She looked terrified. Because your father told me never to let you go there. Elvis froze. Why? She shook her head. He said if you ever found out what was inside. She looked at the boy. You would blame yourself. Elvis's face hardened. For what? She didn't answer. Ma'am, she looked at him. What did he mean? Her eyes filled with tears. He never told me everything. But you know something. She nodded. One thing. What? She whispered. Your father didn't die believing you had forgotten him. Elvis stared at her. What did he believe? She looked toward the little boy. He believed you still owed him a promise. Elvis's jaw tightened. What promise? The woman looked down. To come back. Elvis closed his eyes. The memory returned. That night, that door, the young man beside him, the words. If you ever become famous, don't forget where you came from. And Elvis's answer, I'll come back. He had promised. Then his life exploded. The tours, the records, the movies, the screaming crowds, the lights, the money, the fame. And somewhere along the way, he never came back. Elvis opened his eyes. The guilt was visible now. The little boy looked up at him. You didn't know? Elvis shook his head. No. The boy reached for his hand. Elvis took it. Then maybe my dad wasn't angry with you. Elvis looked at him. Why would you say that? Because he told me something before he died. What? The boy leaned closer. He said, he paused, then whispered, If Elvis ever asks why I left. Elvis waited. Tell him I never left because I was angry. Elvis's eyes filled with tears. Then why? The boy looked directly at him. He said he left because he wanted you to become the man you were supposed to become. Elvis looked away. For several seconds he couldn't speak. Johnny Carson quietly stepped closer. Elvis? Elvis wiped his face, then he looked at the cameras. I'm sorry. He turned to Johnny. I have to go. Johnny nodded. I understand. Elvis looked at the boy. Do you trust me? The boy nodded. Yes. Then come with me. The audience erupted. Elvis walked toward the side of the stage. But before he reached the exit, the boy suddenly stopped. Wait! Elvis turned. The boy looked terrified. What? I forgot something. He reached into his mother's purse. She immediately tried to stop him, but it was too late. The boy pulled out a second envelope. He handed it to Elvis. This one isn't for you. Elvis frowned. Then who is it for? The boy looked at Johnny Carson. It's for him. Johnny stared. Me? The boy nodded. Johnny opened it. Inside was a single photograph. Johnny looked at it. His face changed. Elvis noticed. What is it? Johnny didn't answer. He slowly turned the photograph toward Elvis, and Elvis's blood ran cold. Because standing in the photograph, beside the boy's father, was Johnny Carson. But the photograph was dated decades earlier, and Johnny wasn't supposed to have been there. Elvis looked at Carson. Johnny looked at Elvis. Neither man spoke. The audience sensed something was wrong. Johnny finally whispered, Where did you get this? The boy answered, My dad gave it to me. Johnny stared at the photograph. That's impossible. Why? Johnny's voice became quieter. Because I never met your father. The boy shook his head. My dad said you did. Johnny looked at Elvis. Elvis looked at the photograph again. Then he noticed something in the corner. A handwritten note. 3 words. Ask Johnny why. Elvis slowly raised his eyes. Johnny. Carson didn't respond. Elvis, Johnny whispered.
What? There are some things. He stopped, then looked toward the cameras. That should never have been recorded. The studio lights suddenly went dark. The audience gasped. For a few seconds, there was nothing but darkness. Then one emergency light came on. Elvis was standing beside the little boy. Johnny was still holding the photograph, and somewhere backstage, a door slammed. Elvis turned toward the sound. He knew that sound. He had heard it once before, decades ago, on the night everything began. The boy grabbed Elvis's hand. Was that the door? Elvis stared into the darkness. Yes. What door? Elvis tightened his grip around the old key. The one my father told me never to open. Then, from somewhere behind the studio wall, came 3 slow knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Elvis looked at Johnny. Johnny's face had gone completely pale, because he knew exactly what those 3 knocks meant. And apparently, so did the little boy.
Knock, knock, knock. The sound echoed through the dark studio. Nobody moved. The audience had stopped breathing. Elvis stood completely still, the old key clenched inside his fist. Beside him, the little boy was staring toward the darkness backstage. Then he whispered, "That's it." Elvis looked down. What? The 3 knocks. Elvis's face changed. "You've heard them before?" The boy nodded. "My dad used to do that." Elvis's heart sank. "Why?" The boy looked toward his mother. She was crying. "He told me," the boy swallowed, "that if I ever heard those 3 knocks again, I would know that it was time." "Time for what?" The boy looked directly at Elvis. "To open the door." Another silence. Then Johnny Carson stepped forward. "Elvis?" Elvis turned. Johnny was holding the photograph with both hands. His face was pale. "You can't open that door." Elvis looked at him. "Why?" Johnny didn't answer. Elvis took 1 step closer. "Johnny." "Why?" Carson looked toward the little boy, then at the photograph. Finally, he whispered, "Because I was there the first time." Elvis froze. The audience erupted in confused whispers. Johnny closed his eyes. "I lied." Elvis stared at him. "You told me you never met his father." "I know." "Why did you lie?" Johnny's voice trembled. "Because he made me promise." "Promise what?" "Never to tell you." Elvis looked at the old key in his hand. "Tell me now." Johnny shook his head. "I can't." Elvis stepped closer. "You can." Johnny looked at the little boy, then back at Elvis. "He knew you would come back someday." Elvis's voice became barely audible. "Come back where?" Johnny pointed toward the backstage door. "There." The entire studio seemed to disappear. Elvis stared at the door. The same 3 knocks. The same feeling he had carried for decades. He walked toward it. The little boy followed. Johnny grabbed Elvis's arm. "Wait!" Elvis stopped. Johnny whispered, "You don't understand what you're going to find." Elvis turned. "Then tell me." Johnny looked at him. "You're going to find out that your friend never abandoned you." Elvis's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" Johnny swallowed. "He was protecting you." "From what?" Johnny didn't answer. Elvis pulled away. He inserted the old key into the lock. It fit perfectly. For a moment, he couldn't turn it. His hand trembled. The boy looked up at him. "You don't have to do it." Elvis looked down. "Yes." "Why?" Elvis squeezed the key. "Because your father waited long enough." He turned it. Click. The lock opened. The door slowly swung inward. A cold draft moved through the hallway. The room beyond was almost completely dark. Johnny stayed outside. The little boy entered beside Elvis. His mother followed. Elvis took 1 step, then another. The room smelled old. Dust, wood, paper, memories. There was almost nothing inside. 1 wooden chair, 1 small table, a record player, and on the wall, a single photograph. Elvis walked toward it. He stopped. It was the same photograph he had been holding, but this one was larger, much larger. It showed Elvis as a young man. Beside him stood the boy's father, and standing behind them was Johnny Carson. Elvis turned. "Johnny!" Carson slowly entered the room. He looked at the photograph. "I haven't seen that in years." Elvis stared at him. "Why were you here?" Johnny looked down. "Because your friend asked me to help him." "Help him with what?" Johnny walked toward the table. He touched the old record player. "This." He lifted the lid. Inside was a vinyl record. No label, no title, just a handwritten date. Elvis looked at it. The date was decades old. His expression changed. "That was the night." Johnny nodded. "Yes." Elvis picked up the record. "What is this?" Johnny looked at him. "Something your friend recorded?" Elvis stared. "My voice?" "No." Johnny shook his head. "His." Elvis looked confused. "Why?" "Because he knew you might never come back." The little boy stepped closer. "My dad wanted you to hear it." Elvis stared at the record. His fingers trembled. "Why didn't he give it to me?" Johnny answered, "Because he believed that if you heard it too soon," he paused, "you would abandon everything." Elvis looked at him. "And if I heard it too late?" Johnny's eyes filled with tears. "Then you would finally understand." Elvis placed the record on the player. The needle descended. Static filled the room. Then, a man's voice, old, quiet, familiar. Elvis stopped breathing. The little boy smiled through his tears. "That's Dad." The voice spoke. "Elvis." Elvis closed his eyes. The recording continued. "If you're hearing this," a pause, "then my son found you." Elvis's face crumbled. The little boy reached for his hand. The voice continued. "I always wondered whether you would remember this place." Elvis looked around. "I knew you might become famous." A faint laugh came through the recording. "Actually, I knew you would." Elvis smiled through tears, but I also knew something else. The recording crackled. "You would spend your life surrounded by people." Elvis looked at Johnny. "People who loved the man on the stage." A pause, but very few would remember the young man underneath. Elvis lowered his head. The voice continued. "I never wanted anything from you." Another pause. "I never wanted money. I never wanted fame. I never wanted my name beside yours." The boy's father breathed slowly on the recording. "I only wanted you to remember one thing." Elvis stared at the record player. "Never let the world convince you that being loved means being alone." Elvis's eyes filled completely. The boy looked at him. His father continued, "And if you ever meet my son," the recording crackled, "tell him I was proud of him." The boy covered his mouth. His mother began crying. The voice continued, "And tell him," a long pause, "that the greatest thing I ever did was become his father." The boy broke down. Elvis immediately pulled him into his arms. The child buried his face against Elvis's chest. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then the recording continued. "But there is one more thing." Elvis slowly looked toward the record player. The voice became quieter. "Elvis, I need you to forgive me." Elvis frowned. "For what?" The recording answered, "For the truth." The music stopped. Silence. Elvis looked at Johnny. "What truth?" Johnny didn't answer. The recording continued. "I never told you why I disappeared." Elvis stood completely still. The voice spoke again. "I wasn't running from you." A pause. "I was running from the people around you." Elvis's expression changed. Johnny looked away. The voice continued. "There were men who wanted control over your career." Elvis's eyes narrowed. They knew I could see what they were doing. The recording crackled. They threatened me. Elvis whispered, "What?" The boy's father continued. They told me that if I stayed near you, they would destroy everything you had built. Elvis's jaw tightened. So I left. The voice became softer. I thought distance would protect you. Elvis stared at the floor. I was wrong. The recording stopped. For several seconds, there was only silence. Then the machine clicked. The record had reached its end. The little boy looked up. Is that everything? Elvis shook his head. No. He looked at Johnny. There's more. Johnny nodded. Yes. What? Johnny reached into his jacket. He pulled out another envelope. This was given to me the night your friend disappeared. Elvis took it. His name was written on the front. Elvis. He opened it. Inside was a single page. He read the first line, then the second. His expression slowly changed. Johnny watched him. The little boy watched him. Elvis reached the final sentence. He stopped, then whispered, He knew. Johnny nodded. He knew everything. What did he know? Elvis looked at the boy, then at his mother, then at Johnny. He knew I would eventually become exactly what he warned me about. Johnny's eyes filled with tears. What do you mean? Elvis folded the paper. He knew fame would make me forget how to be myself. The room went quiet. The little boy looked at him. Did you? Elvis looked at the child. For the first time, he didn't try to hide. Yes. The boy didn't judge him. He simply took Elvis's hand. Then don't forget anymore. Those 5 words broke something inside Elvis. He pulled the boy into a hug. The king of rock and roll, the man millions of people thought had everything, stood in a forgotten room holding a little boy whose father had spent decades trying to remind him of who he was. Johnny watched silently. Then Elvis whispered, I think your dad sent you here to save me. The boy shook his head. No. Elvis looked at him. He sent me to save you. The boy smiled. He sent me to remind you. Of what? That you're still Elvis? Elvis laughed softly through tears. Not the king? The boy shook his head. No. Then who? The boy answered, Just Elvis. For the first time that night, Elvis smiled. Not the smile of a superstar, not the smile of a performer, the smile of a man who had finally found something he thought he'd lost forever. They returned to the studio. The audience was still waiting. Johnny Carson stood beside the stage. The cameras were still rolling. Elvis walked back under the lights. The room erupted. But Elvis didn't immediately sing. He walked to the microphone. He looked at the audience, then at the little boy standing beside him, and he said, Tonight, I came here to sing. The crowd cheered, but somebody reminded me why I started singing in the first place. The audience became quiet. Elvis looked down at the boy. This little man stopped the show tonight. Laughter and applause filled the studio. The boy smiled. Elvis put one hand on his shoulder, and I think he did exactly what he was supposed to do. Johnny Carson stepped toward them. Elvis. Elvis looked at him. Yeah? Johnny smiled. Are you going to finish the song? Elvis looked at the boy. What do you think? The boy nodded. Yes. Elvis smiled. Then let's finish it. The orchestra began. The first notes filled the studio. The boy stood beside Elvis. This time, he wasn't shaking. He wasn't afraid. He looked straight ahead. Elvis began to sing. Then he lowered the microphone toward the boy. the boy sang. His voice wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. The audience rose to its feet. One person, then another, then hundreds. Soon the entire studio was standing. Johnny Carson stood too. Elvis looked around the room. For a brief moment, he seemed overwhelmed. Then he looked at the little boy, and the boy smiled. The song ended. The audience exploded. Elvis hugged the boy, then whispered something into his ear. The cameras couldn't hear it. Johnny couldn't hear it. Nobody knew what Elvis said, except the boy. Years later, when someone finally asked him what Elvis had whispered that night, the boy gave the same answer every time. He said Elvis had told him, "Your father kept his promise." And then Elvis had added something else, something the boy never forgot. "Now I have to keep mine." The little boy looked up. "What promise?" Elvis smiled. "To never forget." The cameras kept rolling, the audience kept applauding, and somewhere in that studio, beneath all the lights and all the fame, Elvis Presley was no longer the king. He was simply a man who had finally found his way back to a promise he had made long before the world knew his name. And the little boy who had stopped the show? He didn't become famous. He didn't ask for an autograph. He didn't ask for money. He simply walked off the stage holding Elvis's hand, because he had come looking for a singer, but he left with something much more important, a piece of his father. And Elvis finally had the chance to give something back. Not a performance, not a photograph, not a signature, but a promise kept.